Good evening, everybody. My name is Kevin Ring. I'm president of FAMM. Thanks for joining us. We're back to our Heart to Heart series. This is our first one. We're very fired up to have Keri Blakinger with us, who is the author of this unbelievably outstanding new memoir, Corrections in Ink. I feel like I'm hawking this, and you can get this and knives at our store online. Um, I'm dying to talk to her about this book. As soon as I saw that it was coming out, I couldn't wait to read it. I read it right when it came out, dying to talk to her about it and talk to her about her reporting and her whole life and career. First, I just want to start, because this is Heart to Heart, this is FAM series, to just acknowledge the passing of Andrea Strong, who was FAM's Director of Member Services for 30 years. Short of Julie Stewart founding the organization, no one worked for us longer than Andrea Strong. And Andrea worked in Kentucky. She was destined to just be a housewife and happy at that. And then her brother was convicted of a marijuana conspiracy and sentenced to life in prison. And she couldn't believe it. And she started agitating, going to the courthouse. And soon she was covered on the local news. She found out about FAM. She flew to Washington, D.C. with her husband, Don, to check out this new group and to say, are you for real? You're going to be fighting for reform for families like mine? And Julie said, yes. And Andrea signed up, and she became FAM's first employee. And for 30 years, she has been the first person anyone's talked to at FAM. If you call us or if you email us, that was Andrea, who was listening for hours on the phone as people shared their worst moments in their families' lives with an incredibly compassionate person. What I love most about Andrea is how complicated she was. A lot of people who do this work are sort of social justice warriors drawn to the cause. Andrea was more conservative than just about everybody on staff. But she saw this as a human issue. And so she didn't care if you were black or white, gay or straight, rich or poor. If you had a loved one in prison, she knew your family's pain and shared it. And she wanted to help. And she helped thousands and thousands and thousands of strangers over the year. People would say, thank God I had her to talk to when I was going through that. And sometimes she gave great advice, and sometimes that great advice was tough love. And it was just encouraging people that you can make it. Others have been through this ordeal. And so in a world where so many people seek attention and public recognition for the work they do, Andrea quietly helped tens of thousands of people without seeking any of that. And, there's people like me who think we could use more Andrea Strongs in the world, and we're going to miss the one we had. So her memorial service will be this Friday. Everybody at FAM sends love to Dawn and the rest of her family. And sorry to start with that somber note, but it's a big loss for us, and we're going to miss her, and we're going to hope to fill her shoes by continuing with the same organization that, works directly with people and feels their pain and tries to help them find a way to fight for their loved ones. And so in some ways, couldn't be a better guest to have on the show tonight, because Keri's been through this herself. And Keri Blakinger, for those who don't know, is an investigative reporter for the Marshall Project. Before that, she was with the Houston Chronicle, and she's written for all sorts of publications from the New York Post, New York Times, BBC, Vice. One of my heroes, Christopher Hitchens, said, everybody has a book inside of them. And for most people, that's where it should stay. And it's a way of saying that, everyone thinks their life story is so interesting, and everybody's got to hear it, especially people who've been to prison. But Keri's is unbelievably interesting. And she not only has an amazing story, but she tells it well. And that's what makes it such a great book. I remember when I first started reading the book, I got to page 15. I just checked it again because this hit me when I was reading it. She said, I seemed I'd hit the age where mean girls are just learning how mean they can be. The rest of elementary school, I spent a lot of time crying in the bathroom as I learned it too. I thought that was such a beautiful turn of phrase and poignant, and made me realize that somebody who reads a lot, that I was not going to just, learn something about this reporter who I really admired and had a lot of respect for, but just was going to be a great story and a great writer. And it was. And so I really can't recommend this book enough. So I want to welcome Keri, and I want to help you kick off, because it's like your life story, or most of your life story. But in a phrase that you used early in the book, you said, I'm tightly wound. a taut rubber band of perfectionism and self-destruction, and I'm about to make things worse. And I just love that couplet early on. And I like the description because you didn't put as opposites perfectionism and self-destruction. Those are not necessarily opposites of, I mean, as I can relate to those two things. But I want you to start telling a story about like, how were you a perfectionist? How did that manifest itself? And then how did the self-destruction come up?
So, as I talk about in the book, I was a competitive figure skater growing up. And I mean, I think that part of the reason that I was into that sport or that I was good at it was because I was such a perfectionist. Um, Back when I skated, and this isn't true now, but this was true for decades in skating. You had, and you might, if people are old enough on this, you might remember at the Olympics a long time ago, they had a really boring part of skating where you would trace a figure eight on the ice.
Yeah.
And that was called figures. And you had to try to trace over the prior line like as closely as you could. And and I was not good at that, but that is like, that was, you had to pass certain figures tests to be able to do the parts of skating with the jumps. So like when I was skating, I mean, the just the bar to entry really encouraged perfectionism. And I mean, I think there's a lot of parts of skating that are more subjective. There's a lot of, artistry and shit. But when it comes to jumping, like that's kind of a perfectionist game because you can be a quarter turn short, or you can land on a slightly inside edge, or, fall out of it a little. Like you can always really beat yourself up that the jump wasn't quite perfect enough. And, I think, my parents were academic minded and pretty demanding. And I think they probably nurtured some of those traits in me. I mean, my mom would give me standardized tests. She was an English teacher, standardized tests for fun when I was a kid. Um, and, I think that skating sort of exacerbated some of that. But I don't know. I'm still pretty work obsessed and tightly wound, I would say. I mean, you
And
know me,
it's an
Kevin.
individual sport too. That's the other thing. I mean, did you play group sports? Because I mean, team sports
I
can bring out a
I
different
did a
thing.
little bit. I played soccer and I was the fucking goalie. Like
Ah,
I
well, of
managed
course.
to be like solo in a team sport.
I mean, is that your way? Is that you? You're gonna do something different or no?
No, I think it was actually just that my parents are not particularly social people, and I don't think they really understood the extent to which socializing your kids matters.
Yeah, yeah.
Cuz growing up, like I can't remember my dad having any friends or doing like anything, literally anything. He didn't go to like dinner or grab a drink or anything social. I can't name a single friend he had. Not that he's not a nice person, he just, didn't have friends. And my mom was the same way. She had a group of teachers she would go out to lunch with like once a year. And that was it. And I don't think that I don't think that they quite understood how important it was to have more frequent social interactions for your kids. And I think, I'm probably awkward and weird normally, regardless. And then you add in that, like, I don't think I was like getting the amount of social interaction I needed. And I was in like individual sports. And then at some point, I started going to a snotty private school where they're not very forgiving about not having good social interactions.
And for
So,
people who haven't read
yeah.
it yet, where is this? I've read this, but like where you
Lancaster,
growing up?
PA, in the heart
Hmm.
of Amish country. I
Hmm.
am not Amish, even though I wear all black. I get asked about this sometimes. I don't
I
know
don't think
what
people are
would make
gonna
anyone think I was Amish.
people mistake you for Amish. Is that what you're saying?
People, I think, just go, "Oh, you're from Lancaster. You must be on." Like, no. I mean, I don't know what would make anyone think that.
Well, you won't be mistaken for that here. But I mean, but you're not deprived growing up in terms of like, you know, necessities
Right.
or economics, right? So it's just small town boredom and you're somewhat introverted or like and your parents are
I
not
wouldn't say it's like
social.
wouldn't say it was like boredom. I mean, I think was I didn't fit in. I was a perfectionist, and you know, um I just had a self-destructive streak. And when
Yeah,
I
let's talk
didn't
about
fit
that.
in and didn't have friends, like I just, I just turned it inwards.
Right. So you're skating, which is not a sport that everyone picks up.
Right.
I mean, it's definitely, and now you're driving long ways to the rink, which has got to be in some ways further isolating because a lot of times people are just playing with their friends after school, doing the other stuff. You're getting up early, you're going to the rink. This is a
Yeah.
serious commitment at a young age. It's happening a lot more now. Like all of our kids are in these leagues where they're going all over, but for when you were doing it, that was pretty early. And then you start with eating and other things where your perfectionism, you're starting to go inward, as you say.
Yeah.
What happens there?
I mean, I had some pretty intense eating disorders in anorexia and bulimia in middle school and into high school. Um and um I mean, those are some, I think, pretty graphic chapters of the book. And those were actually some of the really hard chapters to write, because even after all of the, later homelessness and sex work and drug addiction, um, I think that the eating disorder stuff was some of the parts where I had the most lasting sense of shame.
Mhm.
um I don't know, it's kind of weird the extent to which, like, there's this, like, I don't know, a lot I've talked to a lot of other people that have like a history of eating disorders, and that's still like a thing that I think brings people a very deep sense of shame, like, years later, even more so than like heroin addiction.
Mhm.
It's kind of hard to explain even now, like, talking about it.
Well, I mean, I grew up in a family full of alcoholics, and I know alcoholism well. And I dated a woman when I was in law school who was bulimic, and I thought that was alcoholism times 1,000. I thought that was so much more difficult and sad, and as you're saying, um,
Yeah, the
just
thing is with
deeper.
eating disorders, you can't just abstain. You know what I
Right,
mean? Like,
right,
you can't be like, "Oh, I'm gonna do abstinence only and then, maybe reconsider in a few years." Like, you literally have to learn to moderate or you will die.
right. Well, you can't, an alcoholic can go a week or two without drinking, as you say, but like you have to every 3 times a day, you're wrestling with this problem you have. You're not getting around it. So
Right.
it just seems so deep. And there's a lot of, I mean, I don't know this well, but there's a lot about, especially for young women, strong mothers, the domineering mothers, and sort of that feeling. You felt some perfectionism already from your family. I mean, you're getting standardized tests for fun. So is that,
Right.
I don't want to blame mom here, but I mean, is that definitely part of it? Did you feel like part of the perfectionism, or was that a different impulse?
Um, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that was part of it. I also think that, um as a young girl in a sport where, I don't know, there's a sense of powerlessness about skating, because the scoring system has changed, but at that point it was a little more subjective. And you can skate your best, and everyone can agree you skated better than someone else, and they might still beat you.
Yeah.
And you're also kind of a commodity. There's so many girls and there's so many fewer guys in skating. And and you have a very regimented schedule. I think my parents ended up being a lot stricter because of the skating, because I wasn't routinely asking for some of the normal things kids would ask to do. So I think I just had also a very a life in which, even for a 13, 14-year-old girl, I had very little agency or control. And I don't think I quite appreciated that at the time, because people always say eating disorders are about control. They are not just
Yeah.
about control. But I do think that, looking back, like, I had so little agency, and this was one of few things that I had any real say over.
Yeah. 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 That makes some sense. And just thinking about how you wrote about it, I get that. Talk about how do drugs come into the picture?
So, so I was skating pairs, where the guy throws you around and it looks all dangerous and shit. And that's how we made it. That's how I made it to nationals, was in pairs, because I didn't have the raw jumping talent to make it to nationals on my own as a single skater. But I was willing enough to do the dangerous shit that I could make it to nationals as a pair skater. But after our second year, my partner decided to branch out and find a different partner, and I just fell apart because, after, he could find a partner the next day. The odds were in his favor. And for me, it could be like weeks or months or never. And after, weeks turned into months, and I was like, oh, I'm going to have to take a season off, like, from competing. And at 17, in a sport where, you're considered old at like 21, 22, 23, that seemed like that was the end, because a year off at 17 could have, I mean, it would have
Yeah.
significantly changed your career, right? So I fell apart, and I was just sort of crying every day. Like, this was, I now describe it as saying it's sort of like, getting divorced and losing your job at the same time, but also losing every job forever. Um, and then my parents suggested that I should go to Harvard summer school. They thought that that would be sort of a nice distraction and like get me going in a different direction. And, maybe I would be happy enough about that I would stop being so distraught about, losing my skating career. And instead, when I went to Harvard, it was the first time that I had, I was very depressed. And at the same time, it was the first time that I had some real control in my life, some real agency. And, no strict parents around or strict skating schedule. And, I just sort of imploded that summer. And as I was saying before, it's kind of weird because right now I'm in Boston, in Cambridge, for the first time since then. Like, I was, it's so weird. Tonight I've been like walking around and seeing these places where, like, I found the spot where I did heroin for the first time. And now I'm going to speak at Harvard Bookstore tomorrow night, which is so wild. 17-year-old me would not have saw this coming.
Well, it's amazing too, reading the book. I'm sure it's infuriating for the bad students out there that as you're going through all this craziness and on drugs and like waking up not knowing what day it is, you're also still killing it at school, which was pretty nuts. Like, so you
Yeah,
have this, you have this aptitude that carries you even while you're falling down. I mean, amazing that you got through that. But let me ask you this: the first time I try heroin, why do you try heroin? What are you thinking at that time? What's is this just a progression and now I'm doing this, or I'm I'm depressed and so I want to escape my, I want to freeze my brain, or it's like, what is why do
I
you
just really wanted to self destruct, and frankly didn't have the guts to just kill myself. So I started with, I think I smoked pot a couple times and then did ecstasy and then heroin. Like, it was not a slow progression. It was not like I suddenly, oops, one day I'm doing heroin. Like, I was actively looking for the most self-destructive thing I could find. And when I got a chance to do heroin, I did, off the, back of my copy of Sons and Lovers, which had been my, senior year summer reading.
So
So
talk about
yeah.
this. What's, I mean, because there's suicide attempts in here. What is the desire for self-destruction? Just depression? Is it, you know what I'm saying? Like what you're just thinking like outside appearance. I mean, yes. Okay. You lost your skate partner. You're this incredibly gifted student writer and you want to burn it all down. And you talk about, like, there's that part where you say, and I'm about to make things worse. You're consciously making things worse, right? I mean, it's not like you're not stumbling into this. You're like, I want to burn it down.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a few things. I think part of it was just some like really black and white thinking. Like, it's going to be perfect or it's going to be nothing. I think that was part of it. And um you know, I think that I think I was unstable, clearly. I mean, it wasn't like I was just sort of like, fuck it, I'm just gonna ruin my life. You know, I
Right.
think I was very unstable. And you know, I didn't I also think, looking back, that the loss of like my skating career was, you know, I know it sounds really bougie and like first world problems, but like I think it's a lot for
No,
a
I don't mean to
kid,
I, yeah, I
you know?
don't mean to belittle
Like,
it. No, no, no. Understood.
because
Yeah.
I was, you know, I was, I guess, 16, 17 when this was happening. And um, that was my whole world. Like, I was leaving school at 10 or 11 every day to go to the rink and train. I'd be back at like 5 or 6. So, like, I was there all the time. That was my whole social circle. Like, you know, that was my whole identity. Like, I was a skater. And, you know, I didn't have any sort of other sense of identity or who I was as a person.
Yeah.
And, you know, I didn't have any other sort of view for what my future would be. Um, and I think I was like really, you know, I think I just really kind of came unhinged from when I lost like all of that. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I mean, also, I don't know. I think I might just be kind of inherently a little self-destructive.
Well,
It's
I
not
was just saying
particularly
this.
insightful, but
You're writing this book. I don't want to skip too much ahead, but like you write this book and you look back at yourself then, and do you think like I remember exactly how I felt then, or do you say I can't believe I thought that then? I mean, I see the world so much differently now. I have this incredibly different perspective, or just like I'm on medicine, so I think clearer than I did before. Like what? How do you look at how you judge things then? Do you look at it like, oh no, that made perfect sense at the time, or you're like, oh, I was young and an idiot. I was so impulsive.
well, I mean, I remember how I felt. Like, I know what I was thinking. Like, and I mean, I was young and impulsive, and, you know, and suicidally depressed, like,
Yeah,
frequently.
yeah,
Um, and, you know, I mean, I mean, I remember how I felt, but, you know, I mean, sure, some of it, looking back, I'm like, I get how 17-year-old me thought that was the end, but like, you know, 38-year-old me knows that, you know, that was not going to be the end. And I don't
yeah,
know what I could have told 17-year-old me to get her to believe that, you know?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Like if you had, would you have taken like psychotherapy, or would you have taken help and counseling? Was that offered? Like, did you have a chance of that? Like, or was that just something like, I'm not talking about things. I'm not thinking like that.
Well, the problem was that, I mean, I did have a few different therapists over the years, and most of them I just didn't trust because, you know, like, they would tell my parents shit.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And and or they would want to do family sessions, which actually tended to cause problems.
Hey, by the way, I've
So,
got teenage girls. I want that. I want that doctor telling me shit. So deal with it.
right, but
I
exactly.
know.
But
I know.
that's the thing, because
I
then,
know.
like, you do that once, and I don't trust any therapist again.
I know. I know.
You
I know.
know,
No,
like,
it's
the
hard.
therapist thinks I should be on antidepressants. Fuck you. I don't trust you. Like, I would go. I was such a brat about it. Like they told my parents something once, and I literally, for like a year or more, would just go in and give one word answers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I'm really impressed at my dedication to saying pretty much nothing. Served me well in prison
Yeah. I
when
was
I
gonna
had to
say,
do like when I had to do drug treatment in prison, and I hated that counselor, and I just didn't fucking say anything.
well, okay. So talk about this. So now, so I always tell people this because it's such a popular thing among reformers to say, people in prison who were there for drugs, it was because it was an addiction, and that they sold to feed their addiction. I didn't meet a lot of people like that in federal prison, but your story is clearly a case where you were addicted to drugs, you sold drugs to use
Yeah.
drugs. I mean, you are a classic case of that. And when did the idea that like, oh, this is unlawful come into it, or like, was that even a thought?
I mean, you know, obviously I knew it was unlawful. Um I actually just walked by the place where I had my first encounter with police. That was here in Boston. But I mean, I knew it was unlawful, but I think
I
now
don't mean
looking
just
back,
unlawful. I mean, like, I'm going to get in trouble for this, or I could get in
well,
trouble
so
for
I
this.
mean, the thing is, I think looking back, that you have to tell yourself when you're in an active addiction that statistics don't apply to you. Like,
Yeah.
you're not going to be the one that's going to get HIV. You're not going to be the one that's get arrested and go to jail. You're not going to be, well, I didn't care if I was the one that overdosed, but like, you have to tell yourself that various statistics are just not going to apply to you. And I think that's exactly how I, felt in relation to the possibility of getting arrested. I just, let myself believe it wasn't going to happen to me. And it's interesting because now that I'm not on drugs and have, you know, really in a big way learned that yes, statistics very much apply to you. um, I I'm actually like quite paranoid and risk averse. Like, I've gone completely the other direction.
Yeah. Well, for those who haven't read, like, talk about, because I mean, so much of this results with you going to prison in New York State, but first interaction with the law, and that's your first, how many, and like, how does this sort of,
Yeah, so I
disintegrate here?
really had only had like two arrests. Like, I
Yeah.
had one arrest in New Jersey. I had so I'd after I started using that summer when I was 17, I ended up living on the streets for a few months in Boston here, and doing sex work, and you know like living in a homeless encampment, and had a few interactions with police, but no like arrests or anything. And then I went to rehab, got out, started college at Rutgers, stayed sober for a little while, but like kind of knew that wasn't going to stick because like I was still internally a mess. I knew that like I was still, just very self-destructive, chaotic, a mess. And I went back to using. And then at one point, I got pulled over with some friends on the way back from a strip club that I'd been working at. And, and there was some, I don't know, like a gram of Coke or some shit like that, and a gram of weed in the car. And I ended up, getting arrested and said it was all mine. And ended up surfing porn with the cops in the police station, and then let out ROR, and I got probation, pretrial intervention. So I ended up, passing the probation, which was a goddamn miracle. But really it came down to I paid the fine and they wanted to get rid of me. Because I mean, I did not pass a large number of those drug tests. um and but I finished the probation with no conviction. So then after that, continued using for years, and by the time I finally got arrested, the time that landed me in prison in 2010, I had never had a conviction, and I'd never spent like an overnight even, or even a few hours in a jail. I literally didn't know the difference between jail and prison. Definitely wouldn't have known the difference between like feds and state. I mean, what that meant. I understood what those words mean, of
Right.
course,
Right.
but like I wouldn't have understood what the sort of difference in the systems would have meant. And yeah, so I mean, it was in 2010 was the time that I got arrested that actually landed me in prison. And of course, since you guys were started about mandatory minimums, there is a nice section in here about mandatory minimums as
Yes.
relates to my sentence,
Yes.
because I got 2.5 years because I was arrested in 2010. And I was in New York where there were, of course, Rockefeller laws. And I had enough that I would have, under the, like older version of the Rockefeller laws, like I would have gotten 15 to life and I would still be in prison and not even eligible for parole for another couple of years.
It is amazing when people talk about reform, and we have some common sort of
Yes.
people who complain about reform. that's a perfect example. I remember when you were researching this book and you were talking about Rockefeller, and I always think of like before I got arrested and charged, I didn't know what the Booker decision was, right? And all of a sudden, the federal sentencing guidelines are advisory, not mandatory. That could have saved my life. I mean, and yet I didn't know that. And these are things that, like, thank goodness for progress. And there are a lot of
Right.
people who were spared much harder. So when I read the book, I knew there was drugs, I knew there was prison, all this sort of stuff. The sex work, which you talk about so casually, and I don't mean to ask this in a prurient way, where does that come from? In, like, you're thinking of, this isn't like, oh, this is what I grew up around, so I know this is something that people do. This is you. I want money. I want to hurt myself. What is that impulse?
Well, when I started, I was 17 and I couldn't get a legit job
Oh,
without, and like I just didn't have ID and shit. Like I think you needed like parental permission at that point. So somebody introduced me to a woman who was, she and her boyfriend were acting as pimps, and I started doing that in Boston. And
oh, so
then
you
when
knew
I was
somebody. So you meet somebody who's doing that, and that's how you're introduced into this lifestyle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I was actively looking for a way to make money, and I tried like, we called it spanging, asking for spare change. I tried that, and I wasn't. I don't know. And that was harder in a place like Boston. Like there was just too many people. You weren't each going to get a ton of money. I don't know. It was even. I mean, college students just don't care. It's
Right.
not a great demographic to beg from. So um so I ended up getting into sex work, and then later when I was in New Jersey, when I was at Rutgers, I started stripping, um because at that point I was not doing drugs and I was in college. That was during the period that I was like sober for a little bit, and it just seemed like it made sense. Like it was like I could spend all this time working a minimum wage job, which will take a lot of hours and be difficult to balance with school, or I can just go to a strip club for a few hours and do some like athletic shit on a pole, and seems
You know what
fun.
struck me about that, though, when I read that, just thinking of like the little I know about eating disorder is this hatred of your body, and yet here you are. Stripping is. I mean, what I'm saying, it's just the opposite. I mean, you're showing your body. So, like, I don't know. It just feels like, is the eating disorder, maybe it was more about control than sort of like this.
Well,
I don't
I
know.
don't think that everyone that's anorexic or bulimic hates their body. Like,
Not uncomfortable,
um,
or
because I think I knew when I was anorexic, I knew what I looked like. I didn't have like body dysmorphia. Like,
gotcha.
I knew that I looked skinny, but like I just wanted to look that way. And and I mean, part of that is just what is normal in skating
Yeah,
is like your ribs
yeah.
showing, you know.
Right.
So I was like also sort of being conditioned to these weird standards. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think to some extent I also thought it also felt like I didn't know how to, growing up with an eating disorder, like I didn't know how to convey how I was feeling, and like looking like skin and bones to some extent felt like that was me telling people like this is how awful I feel.
Oh, wow. Wow. Jeez.
So it's not that I didn't like it's not like, I mean, when I was like 18, 19 and stripping, like I knew I looked okay. But the other thing is, like, dancing was never my actual strength. It was mostly that I worked at clubs where there was a lot of Russians, and I spoke English without an accent. And I would literally just get good tips because I was the one that could carry on a conversation.
This freaking life of yours, it's craziness. I really, like, I read this and I told you I felt like your dad. I don't know how, I don't know how your relatives read this, because I was just like, oh, please don't do that, Keri. I don't want to see that happen to you. And then you go into it and
You know
you'd
what my
emerge from all
uncle
this stuff.
said? You know what
Huh?
my uncle said when he read it? He told me it was good writing, but a bit too long.
Jeez.
Yeah, I know, right?
If your family's not interested in your story, well, tell them. Most people who read right through it and thought it was plenty. We didn't want it to end.
You know what I should have said? This would have been really, really dark. But I was thinking I should have been like, well, I tried to make it shorter at one point, but it just broke my back.
Oh, geez. This is where I get all this confidence from this sort of positive feedback from my family about my memoir, which is written up in the New York Times and praised universally, but gets panned at a family picnic. Thanks. Let me say, so, on criminal justice, obviously, the system now very well. And for those of us who work in reform, this idea of like, I know what I'm doing is wrong. That's why, I thought that point in your thing where you said, I'm about to make things worse. And that was self-destructive, but this disconnect from the consequences of your behavior, like you said, you're thinking, I'm not going to get caught. It's not that I don't know it's illegal, but I'm going to defy these odds. I can do this. That sort of, to me, is representative of a lot of the people I met in prison. When these were not evil geniuses. They just didn't think they were going to get caught. They just didn't think about the consequences in that way, about like, if you had said to them, oh, well, you're not supposed to do this. Yeah, but I just did it. Not because I saw the US code and I looked what the punishments were and I thought, oh, it's worth it. I'm going to cost benefit this. It was just like, I just didn't think about the long-term consequences. I mean,
I also don't think I thought there was going to be a long term.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think I thought
in your own life, you mean?
Yeah. I don't think, I know I did not think that I was going to live to even my late 20s, let alone now being, in my 30s. So I think that was probably also part of me not taking long-term consequences that seriously. I just thought I'd be dead.
Well, do you think that that's true of these, sometimes the gangs you see in some of the cities where, they see their friends getting shot and they're carrying illegal guns and the rest? It's like part of this is about whatever your expectations are.
Yeah, I also think with people that are in that situation, part of it might also be like, well, everyone ends up in prison. Like, it's going to happen eventually. Right. So, like, not even like denying the odds or thinking it doesn't happen to you. But I think there's some people that are just like, well, it's going to happen to everyone. Might as well do this shit anyway.
Right. So then you're in the jail, and it's that great writing. A lot of it is about your time in jail, waiting to go to prison. And what were you facing? What did you think you were facing? This is when now you're learning about the system. You have an attorney, and the drug laws have changed, as you said. So what were you facing? What did you get? And like, when did you go?
So I was, I think the first offer was like 2 to 4, and I got 2.5. So there was like really no substantive negotiation happening there. But I don't think that was my lawyer's fault. I don't think they were willing to negotiate. And like I said, the most, when you talk about the length of the sentence, it's the fact that there were no longer mandatory minimums that made, I think, clearly the biggest difference, because I ended up with 2.5 years. And also there was other factors. Like, I think if I were Black or brown, I think I would have had a long criminal record already, because there are so many small interactions I had with police along the way that I think could have gotten a lot more scrutiny. I can think of tons of times that, like, I just had interactions with Ithaca police and they knew who I was, but I just think they wouldn't have been as willing to look the other way if I'd been Black or brown. And then also the dumb luck of geography. Like, I was in a very liberal blue county surrounded by like red, tough on crime counties in upstate New York. And if I'd gotten arrested half an hour away, they could have stacked on some other charges. They could have not agreed to a plea. Like, I could have easily gotten 10 or 20 years.
So you were never thinking, I'm going to trial on this. You're like, I'm guilty and let's just get the best deal we can, right?
Yeah, totally. I wasn't thinking trial. Like, I literally had a bunch of drugs on me. Like, what is there to try?
Yeah.
Like, it was literally a Tupperware container with a bunch of fucking heroin. Like,
okay, those are bad facts, I admit.
Also, like, they questioned me when I was really high, and I like admitted to it all. I mean, I have no I was so high because as I was getting arrested, I ate a bunch of oxys that were in my pocket. So like I was just annihilated during the whole arrest process. And they questioned me, and apparently I admitted to everything. I have no recollection of that, but my lawyer was like, "Yeah, it's not great, like, but we could get that thrown out because you were so high, but you still had the heroin on you. Like
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
like that's hard to get around."
So you end up staying in the jail how long, and then how long did you end up going to the prison for?
So I was in the jail, I guess, about 10 months, and then in prison about 11. I did
Mhm.
21 months total, which was very normal. I did not have to go in front of a parole board for a flat bid. Just 2.5 flat. Like you do 5/7 on a nonviolent flat bid in New York, or you did at the time. I don't know if that's changed. For violent, you would have done 6/7. So like it was all, there was, as long as you didn't like fuck up in some major way, like you could get a few tickets and still get out then, but like as long as you didn't fuck up in some major way, you were going to get out at 5/7.
Weird thing, another weird thing. I mean, the guy, one of the officers who's overseeing you or guarding you in your jail, you end up seeing him, and then now he's visiting you in prison. Such a weird thing.
Yeah, yep. We dated for a couple years after.
Amazing. Just crazy stuff.
Yeah, I didn't get into this quite as much, but like looking back, well, even after I got out, like it feels like I only later came to appreciate sort of how manipulative and predatory that is, even in a best case scenario. You know, like I don't think there was any way for that relationship to work.
Right.
In the long run for us. I mean, there might be some. I'm not gonna like knock it for everyone. Like I'm sure there's some inmate guard relationship that has worked in the long run somewhere. But I know of a few that didn't. That it just doesn't. It's really hard to make that survive into the free world because you've started in such an incredibly uneven way.
Yeah, right.
And
That differential, that power differential is kind of,
yeah, and I think
yeah.
it's sort of inherently predatory to I don't know, for him to have gone down that path.
Well, I thought it was sweet. No, no. I appreciate that. Reading that would just felt like, yeah, that is unusual. So then you get out, and I'm gonna fast forward a little bit here because you get on your feet because you're a good writer and you have skills, and it gets noticed. And then it isn't long uh, before you're writing for the Houston Chronicle, and then you end up the Marshall Project, and now this is how people know you, is now you're the one who's holding prisons to account. And the thing I guess I want to ask you about that is doing this work. I mean, you have this like firsthand experience, and so do you feel like you're like, I'm just going to stick it to the man daily because this happened to me? Or how do you have perspective on like, well, wait a minute, there's some dangerous people out there. Obviously, some people need to be, held. And like, how do you, like, I'm not saying you have to be objective in like some weird way that is impossible for you, but how do you see the criminal justice system as like just fundamentally broken to its core because you had this experience? Or it's like, look, there's things it has to do, but there's these multitude of problems that need to be addressed, and I see them having been through this experience.
I never went into this being like I want to, hold the system accountable for, my own bad experiences. I recognize I mean, despite as dark as this book is and as dark as even the prison parts are, like I fully recognize that I had a pretty easy prison experience. I was in New York. Like I now live in the South. Like I report on Texas
Yeah,
prisons. Like
yeah, yeah.
I have seen plenty of videos about what a bad prison experience really looks like, So I never went into it with that. And in fact, I actually think that I've learned in the past few years stuff that makes me think the system is even more broken than I thought when I was in it. So yeah, I never went into it with that. Um, And, in terms of like, is the system sort of irrevocably broken? Are there people that need to be there? I mean, you know, I know that not just in prison, but like in the time before prison, like in my years of running around with like, some dangerous people on the streets. Like I know that there are people that the rest of the world is better when certain people are not out running around.
Right,
Now,
right,
are there other ways to achieve that? Like,
right, right.
sure, maybe someday. But, I don't actually spend a lot of time sitting around dreaming about what a perfect system looks like because, um, I mean, first of all, I'm a reporter. It's not my job. I don't have to design the perfect alternative to prison. But second of all, like, in Texas, that feels so like like conversations about sort of abolition or what replaces prisons are so far away. Like, I'm just not going to waste my time thinking about that. Like, I spend a lot more time trying to find, what is wrong with the system that we have and ways to hold officials accountable for clear abuses and misrepresentations and things they're doing, wrong.
Right.
Um, and I don't know, that just in the immediate foreseeable future seems like just a lot more productive for me as a reporter than sort of sitting around being like, who needs, does anyone really need to be in prison and what would that look like instead?
That's fair enough. And as a reporter, as you said, that's not your task. Um, I want to talk about one of your things you're proud of because we have this in common, which is a concern for teeth, in particular prisoners' teeth. When I got to prison, um, I thought I had gone to the doctor before I went and to make sure I was okay, so I didn't have to worry about this because I'd heard the healthcare was terrible. This was in a federal prison, and then when I got there, they in my intake and all this stuff. This is the only time you see the dentist, and they said, "Oh, you got a cavity," and I said, "Oh, are you sure? Yeah." And they said, "Put a cop out in to get your tooth filled," and so I did, and then everyone in the everyone's laughing at me. They're like, "What are you talking about? They're not going to fill that tooth." They're like, "There's like a 2-year waiting list to get your cavities
what
filled."
what what prison were you at that point?
It was federal prison camp at Cumberland, Maryland.
Oh, okay, Cumberland.
And so they're like, the dentist tells you to put a cop up, but they're not going to fill any teeth. And I was like, oh. And so I felt, I was new, so I just felt like an idiot. And then they said, oh yeah, it's like a 2-year waiting list bureau wide. And then this guy who I was sleeping on the bunk below me, this guy Mehdi, was in for I think bank fraud. He had 8 teeth removed while he was in prison during his like 12 years because you get a cavity, you report it, they say go to commissary and get the ibuprofen, and then it gets so bad you're like, I'm dying. Then they give you prescription ibuprofen, and then it gets so bad they take it out. So he had 8 teeth removed. I think this guy's like disfigured from when he came in. He was his businessman, whatever. You have so I've always been drawn to this story that you discovered in Texas about dentures. So do you mind talking about that? Because that is the kind of thing I think for like, especially like families who are watching this, like good reporting, like save things during COVID, because there's so little oversight. So when reporters get on this stuff, it actually can make a difference. And so I know that was gratifying to you. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so when I was at the Chronicle, I got a tip that supposedly the Texas prison system was going to give everyone on death row dentures. And I was like, wait, they don't give people dentures like if you don't have teeth? And it turned out that tip was wrong. They were not going to give everyone dentures, but the idea that they didn't give people dentures was correct. And I investigated it for, 11 months and found that if you didn't have teeth, they would just puree your food in your mess hall tray in a blender and pour it in a cup and serve it to you that way. And I wrote about it, and there was one particular state senator that was really incensed, and he pressured TDCJ to do something, and so they bought a 3D printer to start 3D printing teeth. It and they started, they ramped it up quite a bit before COVID, and then COVID hit, and even during COVID, I don't know how this happened because they had they supposedly weren't transporting people, but they still did, 3 or 4 times as many dentures during like per year during COVID as they had before I wrote those stories. So like they were still doing more teeth. And they're starting to do a little more now since COVID, but it's also been disappointing that they could do so many more than they are. They've prioritized, I think they didn't tell me this at the time when I wrote that story, but it seems that they've prioritized certain, high needs, which I think they said was going to be diabetics.
Mhm.
So they're doing, I don't know, there's several hundred guys that have teeth because of my story, but it's also so frustrating because there are hundreds, well, probably thousands more that, it's like $50 to $70 a set for 3D dentures. So, they could give out a lot more teeth than they do. um and this is the thing about covering prisons, like, you can have impact, and you can have pretty significant impact, and having that impact actually stay in place and continue to happen at the level that was initially promised is challenging, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. So families, who we work with and who are, begging for oversight because there's no oversight really of any of these facilities. And like I said, during COVID, we were lucky for reporters writing so much because the institutions were locked down, whatever. And so it was really just what was getting out from the people incarcerated, telling their families or them sharing videos or sending stuff out. And so that's how we learned a lot. And for a lot of family members who have loved ones inside who are still going through stuff, their biggest thing is, I need to bring attention to this, right? So they'll call their lawmakers or whatever, and that doesn't happen. And I'm sure, how do you interact with people inside prison or their loved ones? Because I think everyone thinks like, oh, I tell you this happened, write about it, and that you'll have the same result you had, for instance, with those teeth. But there's got to be more that goes into that, right? Like what kind of information that is needed, like you can't write any story you want. It's sometimes we have to say to people, it's like what we think is interesting in a story and it's terrible treatment is most people are going to shrug and just say, oh well, they're in prison and that's what happens. So I guess like the question is, how do we get more oversight of prisons outside from the structural changes we're trying to make? How do we get more media to cover it, and what can families do to bring attention to stories where there is abuse? There's no question. Sometimes it's he said, she said, but sometimes it's clearly a problem, right? Like in Dublin, California, the federal prison, all of a sudden it's like, oh, there was a rape club and it was a badly kept secret. Everyone knew
Yeah.
it. So that meant for years people were talking about it, but no one was reporting on that. How do you break through? Because I'm sure you have stories that even your editor's like, I don't know if that's really enough. But like what becomes enough?
um I mean, what becomes enough depends on the story, but for I mean, part of it is the number of complainants, like more people that can, like, for the okay, so the um for the dentures, for instance, I spent a lot of time looking for guys that didn't have teeth, and found, like, I don't know, a dozen or so. So, or 2 dozen or so. So, and then eventually after the story, I got like tons more that wrote me. But
Right.
I mean, part of it is just, when you reach out to a reporter, like, um, the best case scenario for you is if whatever tip you're giving them happens to fit into some story that they're already collecting examples for. Like if you write the right reporter when they're already working on a story, like for instance, right now, I've been working on a story about people not being able to actually get Suboxone in BOP. Like Beth and I have been working on this for like months. We've been sort of collecting like the perfect examples, right? And one of the things with that is also that we wanted some amount of documentation. Some people have it, some people don't. But one of the other great resources, especially for people in BOP, is the all of the BPs and their responses, all those grievances and the responses. Um, it doesn't matter if they sided with your loved one or not. Like if you get, like, some of the most helpful things that I've found in reporting have been the crazy shit that prison officials will say in response to a grievance, because they all treat a grievance as if it's never going to be public. They all treat it as
Well,
if
that's
like,
even saying that is important. So that's another thing of like people creating a paper trail of their
yes,
grievances and keep
yeah,
collecting all the responses.
yeah, you don't have to win. Like
Yeah.
sometimes that is just just having the crazy responses. Like one of our best pieces of reporting for this Suboxone story, I think, is this whole string of responses that one particularly one particularly, like, I don't know, well informed um prisoner has written. Like he wrote some, I mean, he could have written like legal briefs off of these. Like some of them are very well written grievances, and he lost them all, but he got like detailed responses in which, BOP articulated policies that we didn't find in writing elsewhere. You know,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
sometimes they'll just, and this was an issue with the dentist reporting too. I was asking people for their grievances because sometimes I was finding, for instance, that they were denying people based on things that were not actually part of policy. So sometimes, like, this is the way that you catch them admitting to a practice that is not policy and is actually what is happening on the ground. And the policy might sound fine, but it's the way that it's carried out that is problematic. And it's the grievances that often document that.
No, that's really good advice. And I think that, I mean, that's the frustration for people is they know something's going wrong and it's hard to prove. Do you have trouble? This is the last question. Do you have trouble talking to people in prison? Do people worry about retaliation and reaching out to you either by email or by phone? I mean, you're pretty wide open in that way. I know people do reach out to you, but do you do you hear from people in BOP or in state prison that they fear talking to a reporter something's going to get them in trouble?
I was just smiling because your cat was looking at you
Oh
very
yes,
confused.
of
That was
course. Yes,
adorable.
yes. She's
Um,
telling me it's time to wrap up.
it's funny. I used to more frequently get people saying, like, not being sure if they could trust me in terms of, like, will I really protect them and prevent their identity from being known to avoid retaliation. I actually can't even remember the last time that someone has sort of doubted me and needed assurances on, will I be able to help them avoid retaliation. And I think this is just from, having covered it long enough that, people have read my shit, or, they have heard my name. Um, or in the case of people with contraband phones, like, I mean, they're following me on Twitter, they're following me on TikTok. Like, they've seen that I have used reporting with contraband phones before. So they know that I know how to, protect people in those scenarios. Or, like, I know how important it is to avoid even revealing the unit.
Yeah, right. Well, like I said, my cats come in here to tell me it's been an hour. I could have talked to you for another hour. Um, Keri Blakinger is with the Marshall Project. You should follow her on Twitter. And what else? I know you're on TikTok
I
now.
am on
Very
TikTok,
fancy.
yes.
Very fancy. What? Any other snap face chat book thing
I
types
mean,
things?
I'm on Instagram, but, like, I'm not big on Instagram. Like, I see that I think that if this is the Amy that I'm assuming it is, then I think she's from TikTok. So
Oh, okay. Well,
I
look
have
at
I
this.
have one person I interact with a lot on TikTok is
Look, we got a fancy graphic here that says you can go to your website at kerryblakinger.com. I'm very impressed with our crack team for putting that up there.
I'm impressed with myself for managing to get a WordPress site to work. So.
Corrections in Ink. I'm telling you, I mean, it's just a great book, and I know there's a lot of people who go to prison, they come back and they think, oh, I've got to tell my story. It's so interesting. And it's just like everybody else's story. This is not like everybody else's story. And it's also really just told in an engaging way. So,
And it's
and
out
I
in
just want
hardback now. It's also, like,
yeah.
Audible. Hey, yeah, it is the right Amy. Okay, I was right. Hi, Amy. So it's out in Audible and Kindle, and right now it's only in hardback. So the prisons that can have hardback can get it now, but it will be out in softback next year. and there's usually a year in between.
And
And when
if
that,
you're in our Facebook group, we have posted a couple times your crowdsourcing way for
yeah.
people to get it
So
sent
I'll
to
be
their
doing
loved
that
ones.
again when the
Paper.
softback comes out.
Yeah,
I'll do a separate crowdsourcing to try to get copies funded for prisoners. So yeah.
All right. And also just thank you for your reporting. And, it's hard to get people interested in this. Luckily, you already are. And so that's a huge help for our families and for all of us who are trying to just have a little bit of decency and humanity in our prisons. As long as we're going to have them, we might as well make them, a little bit more livable. So thank you for all that you do. Thanks everybody for watching. And as I said, this is the first. We're going to start doing more Heart to Hearts for the rest of the summer. We have got our Visit a Prison Challenge coming up, so we're going to be talking about that in the near term. But thanks to Keri Blakinger and thanks to everyone on our team for putting this together. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. I'll see you.